Day, the engineer's burden. The train wheels screeched against frozen rails as Hugo Schmeisser stepped onto the platform at Tula, Russia. December 1945. The war was over, but his captivity had just begun. Soviet guards flanked him, their breath forming clouds in the bitter air as they led him through snow-covered streets toward an industrial complex that would become his new workshop and his prison. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of knowing what he had created. The scent of gun oil still clung to his fingers, a phantom reminder of the Haenel factory in Seoul, where his revolutionary design had changed warfare forever. That half-assembled rifle on his workbench seemed a lifetime ago, though only 3 years had passed since that evening in 1942, when shadows stretched across the factory floor and Allied bombers rumbled overhead. The Soviet officer walking beside him spoke broken German. "Engineer Schmeisser, you will work here now. Make weapons for Red Army." Hugo nodded silently. At 61, his calloused hands still knew their trade, but his heart carried a burden heavier than any tool. The Sturmgewehr, his assault rifle, had reached battlefields across Europe, praised by soldiers for its reliability and effectiveness. Yet Germany had lost the war regardless of superior weapons. Now the victors wanted his knowledge to build their own arsenal. The factory smelled familiar: metal shavings, lubricants, the sharp tang of precision manufacturing. Workers glanced at him with curiosity mixed with suspicion. This was the man whose weapon had helped kill their comrades, yet Soviet intelligence recognized his value. They had captured not just an engineer, but the mind behind a revolution nobody had wanted to believe in. In Jena, where he was born in 1884, his father, Louis, had taught him that weapons weren't about glory. They were about bringing boys home alive. That lesson had guided him through the Great War, through designing the MP-18 submachine gun, and through those secret months in 1942 when he crafted the intermediate cartridge that bridged the gap between submachine gun and rifle. Every weapon he created to protect his countrymen inevitably found its way into enemy hands. "You understand why you are here?" The Soviet colonel's question cut through his memories. Hugo looked up from the workbench they had assigned him, seeing tools arranged with military precision. These Russians weren't fools. They knew the StG-44's principles would influence future weapon development worldwide. The AK-47 prototype he glimpsed in another corner borrowed heavily from his innovations. "I understand, but understanding and accepting were different things." As evening shadows fell across the Russian factory floor, Hugo traced the blueprints they had given him. The cycle was beginning again. Another nation, another army, another generation of boys who needed weapons to come home alive. The irony tasted bitter as tea served by guards who had once been his enemies. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man reconcile creating instruments of protection that become tools of destruction? The daily routine in Tula began at dawn with factory whistles echoing across the industrial district. Hugo worked 12-hour shifts alongside Soviet engineers who studied his every move, taking notes on techniques that had taken him decades to master. They gave him bread, thin soup, and a small room with a narrow window overlooking the weapons testing range. From that window, he watched young Russian soldiers training with prototypes based on his designs. The selective fire mechanism he had perfected through 17 different iterations now operated in weapons bearing Cyrillic markings. The intermediate cartridge concept that weapons committees had once labeled mechanically impossible was becoming standard doctrine for modern infantry weapons. His fellow German prisoners worked in other sections of the factory. Klaus Weber, a machinist from the Haenel plant, operated the precision tools with quiet efficiency. But Friedrich Hauser, a fervent believer in German superiority, struggled with their circumstances. "We should refuse to work," Friedrich whispered during their brief meal break. "These people used our own weapons against us." "The war is over," Hugo replied, stirring his soup. Boys need weapons to survive, regardless of which flag they serve. How can you say that? You created the future of infantry warfare, and now they're stealing it. Hugo set down his spoon, remembering that evening in 1942 when he first test-fired the Maschinenkarabiner 42. The weapon had felt right, balanced, reliable, intuitive. When frontline commanders quietly requested prototypes despite military leadership's resistance, he had understood that innovation transcends political boundaries. Soldiers in desperate situations recognize effective tools, regardless of their origin. The Soviet engineer supervising his work, Viktor Petrov, approached their table. Unlike the guards, Petrov showed genuine respect for Hugo's expertise. Tomorrow we test your gas-operated mechanism in cold weather conditions, he said in careful German. Your design must function in Russian winter. That phrase carried loaded meaning. Russian winters had stalled Barbarossa, creating the crisis that demanded Hugo's revolutionary weapon in the first place. German infantry, armed with bolt-action rifles designed for the previous war, had found themselves outgunned by Soviet submachine guns in close combat, yet helpless at medium range. The Gewehr 43 was too heavy, too slow. The MP-40 lacked range and punch. His StG-44 had solved these problems, but too late to change Germany's fate. The mechanism will function, Hugo assured Petrov. I designed it for all conditions. That night, in his narrow room, Hugo wrote in the small journal they allowed him to keep. Not technical specifications, those were closely monitored, but personal observations about the strange circularity of his situation. The weapons he had created to protect German soldiers were now being reverse-engineered to arm their former enemies. Yet the principles remained unchanged: intermediate cartridge, selective fire, lightweight construction. These innovations would spread across the globe, influencing designs from the AK-47 to weapons not yet imagined. Outside his window, snow continued falling on the testing range, where tomorrow young Russians would fire weapons, descended from his revolutionary design. The boys needed to come home alive, just as his father had taught him. The flag above them mattered less than the effectiveness of the tools in their hands, but Friedrich's words haunted him. They're stealing it. Hugo knew better. Ideas, once released into the world, belonged to no single nation. His intermediate cartridge concept had emerged from methodical problem-solving, not nationalist ideology. Its spread to other armies was inevitable, perhaps even necessary. Future warfare would be decided at ranges of 300 meters, not the 800-meter distances military doctrine had demanded. How long can a man hold two conflicting truths without breaking? Letters from home arrived sporadically, carried by Soviet couriers who opened and read every word before passing them to German prisoners. Hugo's wife, Martha, wrote of shortages, rubble-clearing efforts in bombed cities, and the strange silence that had settled over Germany after the war's end. She never mentioned the StG-44 directly, but her coded references revealed its growing reputation among occupation forces. The family tool you designed has found new users, she wrote in December 1945. People speak of it with respect, even former opponents. The weight of that revelation pressed on Hugo as he worked alongside Viktor Petrov, refining production techniques for Soviet assault rifles. The Red Army wanted thousands of these weapons, recognizing that small arms had fundamentally evolved. Hugo's innovations, dismissed by his own military leadership until Hitler's personal intervention forced acceptance, were now becoming standard equipment for America's primary adversary in the emerging Cold War. Friedrich Hauser grew increasingly agitated as winter deepened. During their supervised breaks, he would mutter about betrayal, about German engineering serving foreign masters. They'll use our knowledge to threaten the West, he said one afternoon, watching Soviet soldiers test-fire improved prototypes. Every weapon you perfect here could end up killing American or British troops. Or it could protect Russian boys from those same weapons, Hugo replied quietly. The moral calculation isn't simple. There's nothing moral about this. We're prisoners of war, forced to arm our captors. Klaus Weber, the machinist, looked up from his lunch of black bread and weak coffee. Would you rather they shoot us and steal the knowledge anyway? At least this way we eat. The conversation ended as guards approached, but Hugo felt the familiar paradox that had haunted him since the Great War. Every weapon created to protect inevitably found destructive uses. His MP-18 submachine gun had helped German soldiers survive trench warfare, then influence weapons used against Germany in the next conflict. Now his assault rifle was following the same pattern. Viktor Petrov shared his own perspective during a rare moment of candor. Walking through the factory floor, examining production quality, the Soviet engineer spoke of his brother killed at Stalingrad. German weapons were very efficient, he said, without bitterness. My brother wrote about StG-44 in his last letter, said Soviet troops wanted something similar. I'm sorry for your loss. War makes orphans and widows, but also creates new tools for future wars. Your rifle principles will spread everywhere. America, China, Africa. Maybe that's better than one nation keeping advantage. That evening, Hugo received another letter from Martha. This one mentioned reports of American weapons programs, British research into intermediate cartridges, even rumors of Chinese interest in automatic rifle development. The revolution he had initiated in that Seoul workshop was spreading beyond Soviet borders, becoming global military doctrine. He wrote in his journal, "Innovation belongs to humanity, not to flags. The intermediate cartridge solves fundamental problems of infantry warfare. Every nation will eventually develop similar solutions because the physics and tactical requirements are universal." Yet doubts gnawed at him. By perfecting Soviet production techniques, was he accelerating arms races that would define the post-war world? The boys who needed to come home alive now wore different uniforms, spoke different languages, served different ideologies. His father's lesson about protection had become infinitely more complex in a world where everyone was simultaneously defender and potential aggressor. Outside his window, the testing range lay silent under fresh snow. Tomorrow, more young soldiers would train with weapons descended from his designs. Some might use them to defend their homeland. Others might carry them into conflicts not yet imagined. The moral weight of that uncertainty felt heavier than the Thuringian winters of his youth. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What would you remember more? The pride of innovation or the burden of its consequences? Spring came slowly to Tula, melting the snow that had covered the weapons testing range throughout the harsh winter. Hugo watched young Soviet soldiers training with improved assault rifles, their movements more confident as they adapted to the selective fire capability he had pioneered. The factory's production tempo increased, with 3 shifts running continuously to meet Red Army quotas. Dr. Elena Volkov arrived at the facility in March 1946. A Red Cross observer granted limited access to monitor prisoner conditions. Unlike the guards and engineers, she showed no interest in weapons technology. Her questions focused on medical care, working conditions, and psychological welfare. How are you adapting to your circumstances, Engineer Schmeisser? Hugo paused, considering his response. They sat in a small office overlooking the factory floor, where the sound of precision manufacturing created a familiar backdrop. I work, I eat, I sleep. The routine provides structure. But how do you feel about creating weapons for former enemies? That question had no simple answer. During the long winter nights, Hugo had wrestled with contradictions that seemed irreconcilable. His innovations were saving lives and taking them simultaneously. Soviet soldiers equipped with his designs would be better protected in combat. but they might face American or British troops carrying weapons derived from the same principles. Engineering is about solving problems, he said finally. The intermediate cartridge addresses tactical requirements that exist regardless of politics. Dr. Volkov made notes in her file. She had kind eyes that reminded Hugo of his sister, who had worked as a nurse during the Great War. Medical professionals understood the moral complexity of wartime service, healing and harming often intertwined in ways that defied simple judgment. Viktor Petrov joined them for the interview, translating when necessary and providing context about Hugo's technical contributions. The Soviet engineer had developed grudging respect for the German prisoner, whose innovations had revolutionized small arms design. Engineer Schmeisser shares knowledge freely, Petrov reported. He corrects our mistakes, improves our processes. Very professional approach. That evening, Dr. Volkov visited the prisoners' quarters. She brought coffee, real coffee, not the bitter substitute they usually received, and chocolate from Switzerland. Hugo hadn't tasted either since before the war's end. The flavors triggered memories of better times, Christmas mornings with Martha, engineering conferences where colleagues shared ideas without national barriers, the simple pleasure of a well-brewed cup after solving a difficult technical problem. Friedrich Hauser accepted the chocolate reluctantly, his ideological rigidity warring with basic human craving for sweetness. Klaus Weber savored both coffee and chocolate with obvious gratitude, making the small luxuries last as long as possible. "Thank you, Doctor," Hugo said simply. "These comforts are unexpected." "Small kindnesses cost little but mean much," she replied. "Red Cross believes in maintaining human dignity even during difficult circumstances." After she left, the 3 German prisoners sat quietly in their shared quarters. The coffee's aroma lingered, mixing with the industrial scents that permeated the facility. Hugo realized this was the first time in months that their conversation hadn't centered on work assignments, technical specifications, or political grievances. "She seems decent for a Russian," Friedrich admitted grudgingly. "She's Swiss," Klaus corrected. "Red Cross maintains neutrality." "Same principle applies," Hugo said. "People are individuals first, nationalities second. Dr. Volkov chooses to show kindness despite everything. That insight carried deeper implications. Throughout his career, Hugo had collaborated with engineers from many countries. Technical knowledge transcended borders because physics and metallurgy followed universal laws. The intermediate cartridge worked the same way in American hands as in Soviet ones. Gas-operated mechanisms functioned identically regardless of the ideology behind their production. His journal entry that night reflected on Dr. Volkov's visit. "Kindness requires no translation." The chocolate tasted the same as in peacetime, reminding me that some experiences remain fundamentally human despite changed circumstances. Perhaps my weapons serve a similar function, addressing universal needs that persist across political boundaries. But doubts persisted. The AK-47 prototypes he glimpsed in development would eventually arm revolutionary movements worldwide. His innovations, originally intended to protect German soldiers, were evolving into tools for insurgencies, civil wars, and conflicts he couldn't imagine. The moral weight of that unintended legacy grew heavier with each passing day. How many times can a man watch his life's work serve purposes he never intended? The revelation came in late summer 1946. When Hugo discovered documents that had been carelessly left on Viktor Petrov's desk. Technical specifications for American weapons programs, including detailed analysis of captured StG-44 rifles and plans for developing similar assault rifles for NATO forces. The intermediate cartridge concept he had pioneered was spreading faster than he had imagined. British engineers were developing their own selective fire rifles. American designers studied his gas-operated mechanism for incorporation into future infantry weapons. Even French and Belgian manufacturers were experimenting with variations on his innovations. The revolution he had created in that Seoul workshop was becoming global doctrine, exactly as Martha's letters had hinted. But the most shocking discovery was a report about Chinese interest in Soviet weapons technology. Mao's forces, armed with equipment based on Hugo's designs, were gaining ground against nationalist troops equipped with older weapons. His assault rifle principles were influencing the outcome of civil wars on the other side of the world. Viktor Petrov found Hugo studying the documents when he returned from lunch. "You weren't supposed to see those," the Soviet engineer said without anger. "But I did, and now I understand the scope of what we've unleashed." Petrov sat down heavily, looking older than his 45 years. The weight of their shared knowledge created an unexpected bond between captor and prisoner. "Your intermediate cartridge solves fundamental infantry problems," he said. "Every military force will eventually adopt similar solutions. We're simply accelerating natural development." "By how many years? Decades? Does timeline matter?" "Physics is physics. Tactical requirements are universal." That evening, Hugo sat with the chocolate bar Dr. Volkov had given him months earlier. He had saved it, rationing tiny pieces to make the sweetness last. Now, holding the final square, he understood why she had brought such gifts. Small acts of kindness mattered precisely because they remained human in circumstances designed to strip away humanity. The chocolate dissolved on his tongue, carrying memories of Christmas mornings before the war, of engineering successes celebrated with colleagues, of simple pleasures shared with Martha. But it also carried the weight of knowledge about his weapon's global spread. Every bite tasted of both sweetness and sorrow. Friedrich Hauser had been watching him from across their shared quarters. "You're finally understanding, aren't you? That we've been betrayed twice, once by our own leadership, then by these circumstances." "No," Hugo said quietly. "I'm understanding that betrayal isn't the right word. My designs were always going to spread. Technology doesn't recognize national boundaries." "Then why do you look so troubled?" Hugo considered the question while savoring the last of the chocolate. The sweetness had a bitter undertone now, like medicine disguised as treat. "Because I designed weapons to protect German boys, and now they'll be used in conflicts I never imagined. Chinese peasants will carry rifles based on my principles. African insurgents will fight colonial powers with my gas-operated mechanisms. South American revolutionaries will use my selective fire innovations." Klaus Weber looked up from the letter he was writing to his family. "Would you change anything if you could go back to 1942? "I don't know. Boys still needed to come home alive. The intermediate cartridge still solved real tactical problems. But the consequences extend far beyond what I intended." That night, Hugo wrote the longest journal entry of his captivity. "Dr. Volkov's chocolate has become a symbol of complexity I hadn't anticipated. Sweetness and bitterness intertwined, kindness offered by former enemies, simple human pleasure carrying the weight of moral implications. My assault rifle follows a similar pattern, innovation intended to protect becoming tool for conflicts beyond imagination. Yet soldiers worldwide benefit from improved weapons, regardless of which cause they serve. The boys still need to come home alive." The final square of chocolate was gone, but its memory lingered. Like his weapons, it would influence future experiences in ways he couldn't predict. Small acts of creation, whether rifles or kindness, rippled outward through time, changing the world in directions their creators never anticipated. The weight of unintended consequences felt heavier than any tool he had ever carried. Hugo's release came unexpectedly in August 1950, as Cold War tensions prompted prisoner exchanges between the occupying powers. He stepped off the train in Frankfurt carrying the same small suitcase he had taken to Russia 5 years earlier, plus the journal that had become his most valuable possession. The platform bustled with refugees, displaced persons, and families reuniting after years of separation. Martha waited for him near the station entrance, her hair grayer than he remembered, but her smile unchanged. Their embrace lasted several minutes, neither speaking as they absorbed the reality of their reunion. Around them, the sounds of reconstruction echoed. Hammers, machinery, voices calling in multiple languages as Germany slowly rebuilt from rubble. "You look older," she said finally. "I am older, and wiser, perhaps." The house in Seoul had been damaged by bombing but remained habitable. His workshop, where the first assault rifle prototypes had taken shape, now served as Martha's sewing room. She had covered the workbench with fabric patterns and thread, domestic creativity replacing the tools of war. "I kept your journal from before," she said, producing a notebook he had forgotten. "Your early designs for the intermediate cartridge." Hugo flipped through pages of calculations and sketches, remembering the excitement of innovation, the satisfaction of solving complex mechanical problems. The enthusiasm felt distant now, tempered by knowledge of his weapon's global proliferation. In Korea, soldiers on both sides carried rifles incorporating his principles. Revolutionary movements worldwide had adopted variations on his design. 2 weeks after his return, a young American journalist visited their home. William Hayes from Time magazine wanted to interview the man behind the assault rifle revolution. Hugo agreed reluctantly, understanding that his story would eventually be told with or without his cooperation. "Do you regret creating the StG-44? Hayes asked, setting up his recording equipment. "I regret that boys need weapons to survive," Hugo answered carefully. "But given that necessity, better weapons save lives. Your design influences every modern military. Some call you the father of contemporary infantry warfare. I'm an engineer who solved tactical problems. The intermediate cartridge addressed specific requirements: range, firepower, controllability. Other designers would have developed similar solutions eventually." Hayes pressed further, asking about his time in Soviet captivity, his feelings about American weapons programs based on his innovations, his thoughts on the emerging Cold War arms race. Hugo answered truthfully but guardedly, aware that every word would be analyzed by intelligence services on both sides. The interview's crucial moment came when Hayes asked about responsibility. "Your weapons will be used in conflicts for decades to come. How do you feel about that legacy?" Hugo stood and retrieved the chocolate wrapper he had saved from Dr. Volkov's gift, a small piece of foil pressed between his journal's pages. "A Swiss doctor gave me chocolate during my captivity. It tasted sweet despite bitter circumstances, reminding me that human kindness persists even in designed cruelty. My weapons follow similar paradox. Tools of protection that enable destruction, innovations intended to save lives that also take them." He handed Hayes the wrapper, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. This chocolate came from Swiss factories that also produced precision instruments for military use. Every creation serves multiple purposes, often contradictory ones. The responsibility lies not just with creators, but with users and the circumstances that demand such tools. Hayes examined the wrapper, understanding its symbolic weight. "Will you continue weapons development?" "No, my contribution is complete. Others will improve upon these principles, adapt them for new requirements, perhaps discover better solutions entirely. Innovation doesn't belong to individuals. It belongs to humanity's ongoing effort to solve problems." After Hayes left, Hugo and Martha sat in their rebuilt garden, watching sunset paint the Thuringian hills gold and amber. The scent of gun oil no longer clung to his fingers, replaced by the earthy smell of soil and growing things. Yet memories persisted: the weight of the first working prototype, the satisfaction of perfecting the gas-operated mechanism, the strange pride of watching soldiers adapt to his selective fire innovation. "Do you still think about them?" Martha asked. "The boys carrying your weapons?" "Every day. In Korea, Vietnam, Africa, South America, wherever conflicts arise, some variation of my design will be present. Boys on all sides, needing to come home alive. The chocolate's memory lingered too, representing Dr. Volkov's unexpected kindness in circumstances designed to strip away humanity. Small acts of decency mattered precisely because they transcended ideological boundaries. His weapons served a similar function, addressing universal needs that persisted regardless of political systems. As darkness fell over Seoul, Hugo understood that the revolution he had created would outlive not just the regime that had finally accepted it, but probably his own lifetime. The StG-44 had become the template for modern infantry weapons, its principles spreading across the globe exactly as innovation should. Yet the moral weight of that legacy would remain forever balanced between protection and destruction, like chocolate that tasted both sweet and bitter. The boys still needed to come home alive, whatever flag they served. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What legacy would you choose to leave? Brilliant innovation or the wisdom to know when to stop?